I really think that there's a really huge denialism around Mozart's Tourette syndrome. And if you Google it, did Mozart have Tourette's? Basically, what will come up is like he might have had it, but he might not have had it. We can't definitively really know. We don't really know, but we do know. The only reason that we can't definitively 100% like say like with total certainty that he absolutely had Tourette's is because he died like 200 years ago and we can't diagnose him from the grave. But like he clearly had Tourette's. Hello and welcome back to the Dyslexic Linguist YouTube channel. My name is Hope, and today we are going to be talking about something that I haven't really talked about in detail before on my channel, but I have mentioned, and that is Tourette Syndrome. Specifically, we're going to be talking about Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and the copious evidence that he had Tourette Syndrome, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about what Tourette's is and how I think representation of, or the lack of representation surrounding Tourette's is a really, really huge problem that I think goes a lot deeper than most people would expect. So if you're new to my channel, so far all of my videos have been about linguistics and autism, specifically language development / language acquisition in autism, as well as some more socio-linguistic phenomena going on with autism terminology. But today, we're talking about Tourette's, and I think autism is very much like, it's been in the news because of, the horrible things that RFK has said about autism, and I think overall, in general, autism awareness has really gained a lot of traction, mostly in a positive way. Of course, there's also the not so positive attention that's being brought to autism, but I think overall things are heading in the right direction for autism awareness. I don't think that's the case for Tourette's, though. I think even though that there's been a pretty huge shift in awareness towards neurodiversity in general, I think Tourette's has really been left behind. And this will probably come as a surprise to you if you've been to my channel before, but I have Tourette syndrome. For a lot of my other videos, I wasn't able to talk very much from personal experience. I mean, there were a lot of times where I talked from personal experience just about my interactions with autistic people and my observations about language development and autism, but not so much personal experience as in something that I had experienced firsthand. In this video, that's going to be different. I am going to be talking from firsthand experiences that I've had, and so that will really be informing a lot of my perspective on this. And I hope you come to see that Tourette's is not just this weird freakish thing that only affects a few people, and so it's not that important, it's not that big of a deal, and who cares, it's just weird, and why would you want to look into that? But I think people with Tourette's are really amazing. I think we're really creative and empathetic and strong people. It's so, the way that the Tourette's affects a person's life is really complex. It's really a shame that it's the lack of awareness is so huge. A lack of awareness around Tourette's, I think that really comes from a lack of representation. And so as we'll get into, it's pretty ironic that the greatest musician of all time had Tourette syndrome, and he is not represented as having Tourette's. He's not really associated with Tourette's. And I think in general, musicality and creativity is something that should be associated with Tourette's, because in general, I think we're kind of musical people, and it's almost kind of a musical condition where, I don't want to romanticize it, but but also I don't want to, I don't think I'm romanticizing it when I say that the way that we are as people, people with Tourette's, we're very, it's almost we have this rhythm in our bodies that just comes to us naturally. And with the hyperactivity, and not just with tics, but I mean the way that we express ourselves, there's a lot of kind of like musical rhythm to like that like is like naturally in our bodies. Like it's kind of hard to describe, but I think you can definitely see that when we get more into Mozart, just how I mean I really think that his Tourette's directly like influenced his musical genius. I don't think he would have been a genius if he didn't have Tourette syndrome. So the fact that Tourette's is just seen as this like freakish, like embarrassing joke, when really some of the most brilliant people have it, when it's really this like very creative condition. And really, I don't even really like to call it a condition, similar to how I think autism is, when it's referred to as a disability. I think it's when it comes to developmental disabilities, using disability terminology or kind of medicalized terminology is, it's misleading. I think it's stigmatizing as well. Referring to just a way of being as an illness, I don't think is very reflective of what things like autism or Tourette's really are. And of course, they can be very challenging in many different ways. But like at the end of the day, if I didn't have Tourette's, I would not be me. I've had other illnesses. I've had other chronic conditions. I used to have very severe endometriosis, and that was really horrific. And I don't feel like endometriosis is a defining aspect of who I am as a person. I don't think to call it an illness is offensive, but it's like with Tourette's, it's like, yeah, it's challenging. There are a lot of things about having Tourette's that are really, really hard, but it's such a huge part of who I am, and it is such a huge part of the way that I perceive the world, like, and the way I see other people, like cognitively, the way that it's just like shaped. It's it's a developmental disability. It completely shapes your development as a person. So to say that it's just this like illness, I think it does a disservice to everyone when you call it that. So I think we need, in general, I think we need better terminology for developmental disabilities, which I've talked about a lot in my videos about autism. But I just wanted to say that up top, that like, yes, like Tourette's is very, very difficult, but also the social factors, as we will get into, social stigma is the most disabling aspect of really any developmental disability, especially autism and especially Tourette's. Tourette's is a spectrum. It is a very complex condition that really has not been, it's still very not very well understood. It really hasn't been until, the last few decades that we've really started to have a better understanding of what Tourette's is. So Tourette's is neurological and developmental. This means that, you are basically born with it, and it changes throughout your whole life, and it affects many aspects of who you are. And it really kind of shapes the way that, you grow up. And it's neurological in that it's not like just a, what's called like a psychogenic condition. The reason that people have tics, involuntary movements or vocalizations, motor tics versus vocal tics, it's due to basically this like neurological phenomenon that we really don't totally understand, that has to do with dopamine, serotonin, and I can't remember the scientific word for adrenaline, but I think it's like neuroepinephrine or something like that. But it's basically dopamine, serotonin, and adrenaline combined with kind of a unique connectivity in the brain, which is also something that I talked about pretty extensively in my video about autism, my video, The Linguistics of Autism, because that's also what causes autism, is connectivity patterns in the brain being pretty unique compared to, more neurotypical brains. And so that's specifically its underconnectedness like long range underconnectedness and short range overconnectedness. That's the main way that it affects connectivity in the brain. It's not a psychological issue, right? It's not something that, even if you do have a degree of control over tics, like, you know, like I do, and many people with Tourette's do, most people with Tourette's have some ability to suppress their tics. What they say is basically like, no matter what, they have to come out. There's a degree that you can suppress and there's a degree that you cannot. At a point, you just can't control it, you know? Additionally, there are other things like, you know, people with Tourette's, our muscles twitch and contract much more frequently than other people's do. So I get like a lot of different, like, and it's not even like a tic, it's just like our muscles are just kind of hyperactive, I guess. It's like, that's not like a scientific way to like describe it, but it's like we get things like muscle cramps, or like we pull muscles, and like we have like muscle twitches like way more than most people. Like, yes, like the main symptom of Tourette's is having tics, but it really affects us much more deeply than just that. So like I said, Tourette's isn't even really that rare. It's definitely more uncommon than autism, but it's actually about 1 in 160 children have Tourette's. It's assumed that it's very, very underdiagnosed as well, which kind of, as we'll get into, that's kind of a surprising notion to people. Most people assume about what my mouth keeps twitching. I just talked about having muscle twitches, and now my mouth keeps twitching. Most people's conception of Tourette's is basically that it's this like really huge spectacle, and like this idea that you could ever know someone that has Tourette's and not know that they have it is kind of paradoxical to most people's minds. This idea that you could have Tourette's and other people could not know, or that you could hide it from others. Of course, there are people with severe Tourette's that have very, very chronic tics that are very loud and, attract a lot of attention, and that is very debilitating. But it's actually more common for people with Tourette's for it to be minor, for it to be more mild or more minor. There's like around 1 million people in the United States that have Tourette syndrome. I think about 200,000 people have more severe Tourette's. But for the most part, people do have it in a much more mild way. The key to understanding that is what's called, the term that they use is waxing and waning, that tics are not just something that happen constantly all the time, but kind of there's ups and downs to the amount of tics that you have. And there's certain things that might trigger them, or there are certain, situations, or, depending on the context, you might have more tics, but also depending on, where you are in your development. A lot of the time people's like symptoms of Tourette's peak at 9 years old. For me, I was I think I was like 16-ish when my tics were at their absolute worst. But it's like there was a period of my life where my tics were definitely more severe. My Tourette's was definitely like a really, really huge problem. And now, of course, it still affects me all the time, every day, but I can manage it way better. Like, now I would definitely consider myself to have more, have it be on the more minor side. But there have been times, like, if I'm having an issue with medication, that can make my tics really, really bad. And especially for me, hormonal stuff. Like I said before, I used to have endometriosis. My hormones got really, I guess, out of whack. And when I don't have my hormones under control, then that can directly make my tics worse. I mean, it's a direct, cause of making my tics worse. Yes, I would consider myself to have minor Tourette's, but, that's really not the whole story, because even when it is more minor, it's still something that really does affect me. So just for example, I have vocal tics and I have motor tics. I have a lot of facial tics, and especially when because another trait of Tourette's is to have, sensory issues similar to autism. It's very common for us to be much more sensitive to sensory input than most people. And so that's the kind of thing of like, usually if there's something that is affecting me in a sensory way, that will very directly make my tics increase. And so it's like, if I'm sitting in class for an hour, almost an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, by the end of the class, I've probably had a lot of facial tics throughout the entire class. You know, that's just how it is for me. But when it comes to vocal tics, I really only have those when I'm at home, or a lot of the time if I do have them, I'm usually able, you know, if I'm in public and I have them, I'm usually able to suppress them pretty much to a whisper, or, you know, completely suppress them. So it's like, you know, if you're staring at me, like if we're sitting in class together and you're staring at me the whole time, you would probably notice that I have facial tics. But if you're just around me and you're not like staring me down the whole time, you might not notice that I have any tics at all, especially because I'm really not going to be drawing a lot of attention. You know, I'm not very disruptive. And so that's how it is for a lot of people, where it's like, even if like we do have tics and we are experiencing having tics, that's not necessarily something people are really going to notice. And so that's why it's so surprising to people when, you know, people like me say that they have Tourette's, even though this is a much more common experience than more severe Tourette's, is, you know, that you can function in society. You know, you can go about your day and people will not just automatically know that you have it. But also it's like, you really have to understand that it's like, for a lot of people like me, when you go home at the end of a long day, that's when you're going to have a lot of your tics come out. Billie Eilish has Tourette's, and I think she is also on the more minor end of the spectrum. You know, I don't want to speak on her behalf, but I think just observationally, it is my assumption that she's more on the minor end of the spectrum. But there was, and I'm not like a fan of hers, like I don't really know her stuff very well, but like I do know that there was one time that she had an interview where like in between takes, she would basically let all of her tics out, but like during the actual interview itself, she had none. Because there is a level of suppressibility, but, you know, behind the scenes, in between cuts, you know, she needed to let all of them out because like they have to come out somehow. But this is not to say that more severe Tourette's isn't something that also deserves to be represented. And it's also not to say that like the stereotypical conception that most people have of Tourette's, that Tourette's is very severe, you know, that conception isn't really accurate to what more severe Tourette's is either. Can you think of any mainstream representation of Tourette's? I can't, other than that one episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm with the Tourette's chef. I think it was Opening Night. That was the name of the episode, where basically, like, if you haven't seen it, that basically there's this chef who, like, will randomly swear very loudly, and it's a spectacle, and it's a joke, and if you actually have Tourette's, then it's pretty obvious that actor did not have Tourette's. It's pretty obvious that that actor doesn't really know what Tourette's looks like, and that clearly was not a concern of anyone involved in the creation of that episode. Like, yes, it can happen that people can swear very loudly as a tic, but first of all, that's called coprolalia. Saying obscenities is called coprolalia. That only happens in about 10% of people with Tourette's, number one. Number two, there's something, you know, when you see a person with Tourette's, it's usually that it's not just like, especially if you have more severe tics like that, of like shouting obscenities or really shouting anything at all, is, in public like that, not being able to suppress it, that is definitely an indication of much more severe Tourette's. So the fact that it would ever be the only tic that a person would have, where they just swear really loudly and that's it, that's the only, way that they present like their symptoms of Tourette's. They don't have facial tics, they don't have any kind of very, other more obvious or disruptive motor tics. I don't think I find that really hard to believe that that's how Tourette's would really look in anyone. I really hesitate to even call it representation because it's so inaccurate, and it's really offensive because it's like Tourette's is just the butt end of a punchline. It's just a joke. It's just a punchline. He wasn't portrayed as like being this like, you know, super genius creative chef that also happens to have Tourette's. It was just that like, here's this like freak chef that we have that has Tourette's, and it's an inconvenience to everyone else. And what's really fascinating to me, which I think is really ironic, is the fact that, like I said, one of the greatest, arguably the greatest musician of all time, Mozart, absolutely had Tourette syndrome. And this has really been known since the first like major paper that came out about Mozart having Tourette's came out in 1992. So this is not a recent discovery or a recent development it hasn't just like recently come into light that Mozart has Tourette's. To me personally, I think it's really fascinating that there is no representation of Tourette's in the mainstream. Meanwhile, one of the most well-known musicians of all time had Tourette's, but he's not known for having it. He's not associated with Tourette's. The most mainstream representation of him, of Mozart, was in the movie Amadeus from 1994, which I think is a good movie, and I also think it came out before it was really understood that he had Tourette's. So I don't have like any kind of like personal animosity to that film, and I think they do like display him as definitely being like neurodivergent, but he certainly was not portrayed as having Tourette's. So before we get more into the details about Mozart and his life, I want to go a little bit more into depth about the nuances of Tourette's and how it affects people's development. So like I said, it's a spectrum, which means that like everyone with Tourette's really like there are core features, but the way that it affects your development, it really like everyone is unique. Really everyone is very unique. And there's this like saying in like the autism world of if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. I think it's the same for Tourette's. If you've met one person with Tourette's, you've met one person with Tourette's. You can't just like make generalizations about Tourette's or autism based on one experience you've had with one person, because it's such a wide spectrum. You know, every person is unique. You can't just make generalizations based off of a few people in your personal life or whatever. So for most people, the onset of Tourette's symptoms is at about 6 years old. But that can also happen a little bit later in childhood, more into like early teenager years. But regardless, you're going to have if you have Tourette's, you will have an onset of symptoms before 18 years old. There are other kinds of tic disorders. Functional tics specifically can happen in, basically at any age, but what defines functional tics is basically that they have an onset after a very significant traumatic event. I'm sure there is some kind of genetic predisposition to functional tics, but it's not developmental in the same way that Tourette's is. But they do appear to be very similar in a lot of ways to tics and Tourette's. And it hasn't been until much more recently that, functional tics have really been identified as being a condition that people have. So there's not as much known about functional tics as Tourette's, but there is a distinction. But it can also, the lines between functional tics and Tourette's can definitely be kind of blurred. So it's not something we really have a huge grasp on quite yet. But there's also like when you're developing as a child with Tourette's, you usually have kind of a peak in your symptoms of, peak severity. For most people, that peak happens at an average age of 9 years old. For me personally, like I said, I was about 16 years old when I really had my tics at their most severe. But, I'm not like super unique. There was a really long time where I thought I was really unique. and like not in a good way. I didn't feel like really special, like I felt really bad about it. But no, there are a lot of people that are like me. It is more common to have an onset much younger in your childhood. I think I've had tics my whole life, but they didn't become more chronic until I hit puberty, and then they hit a peak a couple years after they became more chronic. And so, I think that's not even that far removed from what happens when it happens with people who have a younger onset, where it becomes more chronic at about 6 years old, and then a few years later you have the peak, and then it kind of goes down. But there are a lot of different pathologies. So for some people, they have much more chronic tics when they're younger, and it kind of fades out into adulthood. So for some people, their Tourette's basically goes totally into remission as adults. But for some people, it's much more severe in adulthood than it was in childhood. So it's really different for everybody. Like for me personally, like even though I had a really huge peak when I was about 16, at this point, I would say that I'm certainly not fully in remission, but they're much less severe compared to just a few years ago. At this point in the video, you're probably like, Hope, where's the evidence that you have Tourette's? And here's the thing, is that people with Tourette's, when we do things that we really enjoy, that we get, really focused in doing, we basically have no tics at all. So, I've seen online like a girl with Tourette's talking about how, like, she would do a lot of makeup videos. I can't think of her name off the top of my head. Maybe I can find her. Probably not, because it was on TikTok and I haven't been on TikTok in a million years. But like, she would get all these hate comments being like, you're faking having Tourette's, because how are you posting all of these videos of yourself doing makeup and you're doing it like perfectly fine, and like where's the Tourette's? And she was like, well, I love doing makeup. It's like my favorite thing to do. So I get really focused and I don't have a lot of tics. And that's kind of how it is for me. I like talking about Tourette's. I like talking about autism. And I have, I think, like close to 6 hours of footage of me talking about autism. And, the cut footage, the uncut footage, it's far longer than that. But I think in all of that footage, I don't think there was ever a time where I cut out me having a tic on camera, because I just really don't have them when I'm this, when I'm doing this thing that I enjoy doing, when I'm focused talking about a topic that really, really interests me. I want to study, developmental disabilities for the rest of my life. This is, basically my favorite thing to talk about. I'm the Dyslexic Linguist, and, here I am. I'm choosing to be here. And because I like doing this, I don't really have a lot of tics while I'm, recording myself. In general, in the future, I think I'd really like to be like a college instructor. I would really like to get my PhD and maybe even be a professor one day. So it's like, I like educating other people. I like doing public speaking in general. I like performing. I used to be in theater, but really what I really loved doing when I was in high school, even when my tics were really bad, was basically like being in like different kinds of like debate programs. I wasn't in like debate club, but I was basically in like youth, like legislation / like youth attorney, like kind of programs where you would like basically do like legal stuff, where you like prepare for like a big conference where, you have something prepared and you kind of have to argue for it when you're in the conference. And so I really enjoyed that. I think for people with Tourette's who do not enjoy public speaking, public speaking would probably make their tics a lot worse. That would be my guess. And, I know that there are times, especially if I do like give some kind of big presentation, usually later that day, my tics do get worse, because there is kind of an anticipatory anxiety. And then once I'm done with the thing, after the fact, that's when my tics kind of all come out. Usually when I'm filming videos, it's like I'm doing this on my own pace. I'm in my own house, I can take breaks if I want to. I'm in a good mood when I film these videos. I make sure that I want to be good for, when I make these videos, I want to like be at the top of my game. I don't want to be like super hungry or super tired, or like I'm not going to like film a video if I feel really terrible. So, there are a lot of conditions that go into, my tics really not being present when I'm on camera. This morning when I woke up, like in the hours before making this video and getting ready to film this, I definitely had a lot of tics. It waxes and wanes throughout the day. It depends on what I'm doing. It depends on if I'm really focused or if I'm not very focused, if I'm getting really distracted. That is probably a time where I would have more tics. But what you have to understand is, like, like I said before, people have this idea of like, if Tourette's isn't really, really obvious to other people, then there's this idea that like how could it be Tourette's if it's not super obvious? But like inherently that is a part of Tourette's, is that it is not always obvious because it waxes and wanes. It goes up and it goes down. It fluctuates. The tide comes in and it comes out. It is not always, this constant stream of involuntary movements and vocalizations. It changes throughout a day. It changes throughout a week. It changes throughout a month. It changes over years. Like I said, I've had years of my life where my tics were way more severe, and years of my life where they're much less severe or much more minor. And that's how it is for most people, is that there's this variability throughout all of these different like sections of or periods of time, of like throughout a day or throughout a month or throughout a year, throughout your whole life. There are fluctuations in how many tics you have, how chronic they are, how severe they are. So for both vocal and motor tics, there are simple tics and complex tics. So the most, common simple tic is like squeezing your eyes, or, blinking very hard, or shrugging the shoulders, single kind of movements that are more simple. And you can also have kind of simple vocal tics as well. So that would be something like a cough, or a really common tic for me is just exhaling. There's not a lot of complexity in, like a grunt, or like saying a single word and kind of saying the same word over and over and over again. But when it comes to saying phrases or sentences, and specifically coprolalia, like I said, obscenities, even if it is just a single word, if it is just a single obscenity, in that case, that would be considered a complex tic, because, and this is what's really interesting, I think, linguistically about Tourette syndrome, is coprolalia and the contextual, situational nature of coprolalia. And like I said, only about 10% of people with Tourette's have this. In general, it's called coprophenomenon because there are multiple different types of this. So, the vocalizations, that's coprolalia. Obscene motor tics is copopraxia. So that could be, the middle finger, or maybe touching yourself inappropriately, or touching someone else inappropriately, something like that. Obscene writing, that is like where you kind of compulsively write a word that is obscene. And so in general, I meant to say this already, but in general, the experience of having Tourette's is basically there are a few different stages to having a tic. So before having a tic, you have this kind of feeling called a premonitory urge. And basically, you feel the tic coming on before you actually have it. And it's not a very good feeling. It's a pretty bad feeling, where you have this really, really strong urge. It's kind of painful. I've seen it described as like, and this is how I feel, is that it's like, it can be like an energy that's like really focused in a specific spot. So it's like, maybe I have that feeling in my eyes, and that makes me tic in my eyes. Or it might be like a full body kind of really intense feeling of energy going out throughout your whole body. And it's kind of painful, I've seen it described as like cognitive pain. And so it's like, it's not easy to describe what that feels like to people without Tourette's. It's kind of impossible to describe how that feels. So lucky you, if you have no idea what that would feel like. Then, you have this kind of urge, this feeling of to do something compulsively, and then you have the tic, right? You say the thing, or you do the motion, and usually there's a feeling of relief as a result of fulfilling the tic. And when you suppress tics continually, that kind of makes it worse. It's like you have this like buildup of energy, and it's kind of painful. That can make your tics a lot worse also. So it's like, I can suppress my tics to a degree. I can definitely suppress my verbal tics, especially when I'm in public. But it doesn't feel good when I do it. And a lot of the time, that's going to come out some other way, especially if it's like I'm sitting in class for a really long time, sitting still for a really long time. That's usually going to come out through like facial tics or something else. And in general, like a lot of my other videos, especially my video, The Autism Industrial Complex, which is like really, really long, the whole time I'm like, I'm moving so much, and that's just kind of how it is. Like for me, maybe I'm not really moving a lot right now, but like I'm a very hyperactive person. I've always been a very hyperactive person. So I always feel like I need to move. A lot of the time, actually, I move my feet and my legs, and that's kind of a subconscious thing that I guess I kind of trained myself to do as like kind of a masking thing of where like I've always been really hyperactive, but I kind of had to learn how to hide it. And it's not that I can stop being hyperactive completely, because I just can't stop it completely. But instead, it's like, you can't see me right now, but it's like I'm usually like moving my foot or moving my leg a little bit kind of all the time. Like it's not something that really ever stops, unless I'm like sleeping. And also, comorbidities are far more common than not. So it's much more common to have, if you have Tourette's, it's much more common to have at least one comorbidity than it is to just have Tourette's in isolation. That's actually really, really rare. So the main comorbidities is ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and autism spectrum disorder. Those are the most common comorbidities. Also, learning disabilities are very common. For example, dyslexia. And so what's really interesting about coprolalia is that it is very, very specific to the context and to the culture. So, saying or doing things that are kind of, inappropriate or obscene, but, especially swear words are very common, but also things like, racial slurs or kind of sexual harassment, saying things of that nature that are totally involuntary. And this is really something that happens especially more in people with more severe Tourette's. Like coprolalia is much more common in more severe Tourette's. So it's like if you see someone of a certain ethnicity, that might trigger saying a racial slur. If you see a person wearing very minimal clothing, maybe that might trigger saying something that is harassment. I think this is really connected to OCD, and that like it's your brain kind of goes to like your worst fear in that moment of like, what's the worst thing I can do when I'm sitting next to, when I'm standing in line behind a black person, and then you say the N-word. Like that's the worst thing that you could possibly do in that moment, and then you do it. So I really do think that is very much connected to OCD. These things really aren't very well understood. Like coprolalia is like really not very well studied, which I like, maybe someday I'll be getting on that, because I think it's really, really fascinating. But obviously it's really debilitating, and this is the most widely known feature of Tourette's, and it's absolutely the most stigmatized. But just to give you another example about the situational, I guess, nature of coprolalia, there was one example that I read about of a person who was raised very religious, and they would have urges to say things basically insulting, God, and saying things that are like blasphemous. There is an urge to say blasphemous things. That's not necessarily like a swear word, but something that goes directly against the social norms and that person's values. And that person eventually became atheist, stopped believing in God. And when they stopped believing in God, they stopped having blasphemous urges, right? Or there's another example of like a Jewish person with Tourette's at a family function for like a Jewish holiday, and then they blurt out, "I love Jesus." It's like, it's not necessarily saying something that's like really like graphic or inappropriate, but if it's inappropriate for that situation, saying "I love Jesus" when your religion kind of, a big part of it is not really believing in Jesus, like that could cause problems. And that's probably the exact thing that you don't want to say. But like other tics, there's this urge to do these things involuntarily, but then after fulfilling the tic, there is a sense of relief. But also when it comes to coprolalia, there's also usually a feeling of shame that comes in afterwards, because a lot of the time these are things that go directly against that person's personal values. And not only that, but it's humiliating and embarrassing, and it will, insulting people that you like is like not very fun. So I would say that that's probably one of the more debilitating aspects of Tourette's, and it's kind of tragic because, these are usually people that are like very caring, that say these things that are very offensive that they really don't want to say. And they're kind of, people with more severe Tourette's are painted as these like freakish people that just can't control themselves and whatever. But it's like, the reality is that is very, very, very difficult for people to deal with. That is very challenging. And you never see that represented. Like, when have you ever seen someone in the mainstream media represented as having Tourette's, period? But let alone like the Tourette's chef in Curb was not seen as being like remorseful about like his, coprolalia. He kind of just like pretended like it wasn't happening in the episode, but it's like that's not how it is for people. Like I think a lot of the time they're very apologetic and they feel really bad about it, which is one of the main reasons that it happens in the first place, because that happens to be the thing that they want to not do the most. So copro phenomenon was actually the thing that made researchers look into the idea that Mozart might have Tourette's. And so specifically, it was at first coprographia. Sorry, these words are so difficult to pronounce. Coprographia. Not to be confused with coprophagia, which is when you consume feces or other types of excrement. Very different thing. Coprographia is writing obscenities. And so Mozart had numerous letters that were very confusing to historians and other people, of where he would say really, really inappropriate things. And many of them were scatology related. And so scat being, once again, feces. A lot of feces talk in this episode today. It's really awesome. And so basically he had these letters to mainly people that he was pretty close with, either family members or very close friends, where he would say things that were related to scat. Usually sometimes kind of graphic things, sometimes like kind of jokes, like humor. And so the way that this is like often portrayed, or like the way that like people kind of reference it as like this like bizarre like scatology obsession that Mozart had, when actually it wasn't just scat. It was other things. In 36 different letters, he had these coprographic features referencing different forms of scat. Arse, piddle. Sorry, these words are so funny. Fart, arseholes, fondling and kissing, sexual fetish, palalia, echolalia, or word games. So I can't get into absolutely every example because there are so many, but palalia is basically when you say the same word like over and over and over and over again. Like the longer you say this word repetitively, usually like you kind of speed up over time. So I think this could be expressed through writing as well, but palalia and echolalia, like that's usually referring to speech, but in this it's like he wrote something that he had just heard someone else say, or he's writing the same thing over and over and over again, or like writing, like by word games it's basically like he wrote like kind of, you know, like puns or whatever, but it was pretty repetitive. And so palalia, it's like saying the same thing over, like that's what palalia sounds like. And then like I think if you just write the same word over and over and over again, that is kind of an expression of palalia. People say, you know, with this like, oh, this bizarre scatology obsession that he had, it's like, well, you know, it wasn't just scat. In general, like these are all kind of obscenities or things that go directly against the social norms at the time. And so there's a lot of denialism around that he might have had Tourette's, which I'll get into later. I think it was after Amadeus came out, there was a lot of kind of, because in the movie he is portrayed as being kind of arrogant, but also being inappropriate. At one point he calls himself a vulgar man. I'm a very vulgar man. And that kind of tipped people off to being like, well, maybe there's something more going on here. And then when it came to, you know, looking at the scatology in his letters, that kind of made researchers of Tourette's, like that kind of set off a bell, you know, the light bulb like went off in their brains, and they were like, okay, that's basically a trait of Tourette's. That's like directly a trait of Tourette's. And so to just kind of say that it's like just to kind of chalk it up to him being this like freak genius, and like we'll never understood why he was so weird, when it's like maybe that was an expression of Tourette syndrome, and like this maybe it wasn't something that he really wanted to do, but he felt compelled to do. And so most of this comes from, in the graphic that I showed earlier, comes from Simkin 1992. This was really the first like big paper about, so there was, you know, the scatological references and other obscenities that he wrote in his letters to other people, but he also wrote a song that translates to lick my arse. I think he was like 26 when he wrote that. When my tics were at their most severe when I was in high school, and like occasionally I really don't feel this as much as I used to. Like I really don't like have this occur as much as it used to, but like when my tics were at their most severe, I remember when I was in high school, like having like my notebook on my desk and writing, you know, the same swear word over and over and over and over and over again, and then like crossing it out or erasing it. And at the time I didn't really know what that was. I didn't realize that was a trait of Tourette's, but like, you know, it would make me feel bad about myself after the fact. I felt like really freakish and weird for doing that. But in the moment, there was a really, really huge sense of relief with doing that. When you have an urge to do something, until you do it, you kind of can't do anything else. Like you can't focus on anything else. So it's like, you know, even if I would feel bad after and being like, why am I so weird? Why did I do that? Like, in the moment, it was like kind of a need to fulfill that. But what's really crazy is that what they also found was that there were upticks in these scatological references in his letters, and, you know, coprographic references in his letters during periods of high stress in his life. Around his first tour in Italy, then basically he had a conflict with his employer when that was at its worst. He had a lot of financial struggles throughout his entire life, but especially with the Archbishop of Salzburg, things were pretty rough for a few years, and that caused or was correlated with an increase in these scatological letters. And then the birth and death of his first son. Later, he had a tour in Germany, and then later, towards the end of his life as well, when he was in really, really ill health. So it's not just these random things. And people will say, the denialism is basically that, maybe he was just saying these things. He was just writing these things because he thought it was funny and he was just a strange person. You'll see that everywhere. Anytime you look up anything about, Mozart and scatology or Mozart and Tourette's, there will always be these, people will always kind of, try to deny it by being maybe he was just a weirdo. Who knows? He might have just been strange and he thought it was funny. But, they say that, maybe, his family or, the people in his, personal life thought that this was a really funny thing to do. And what the author of this paper found was, no, he did this way, way more than anyone else, he was, receiving letters from. I think it was, 12% of his letters had evidence of coprolalia or, obscenities, where for the other people in his life, it was in the single digits. It was, or less than 1% of their letters to him had these kinds of, obscene features. So the idea that that was just it was just in to say these really inappropriate things, I don't think there's any evidence behind that. And also the fact that they correlated so closely with really, really stressful times in his life. I should have mentioned this already, but in general, one of the biggest things that makes symptoms of Tourette's more severe or more chronic is stress. That's really the biggest thing that makes tics worse. So I'll give a few examples of people close to him writing about what appear to be symptoms of Tourette's that he had. Johannes Hummel, describing Mozart's touching compulsion during his little son's successful piano audition. Mozart nudged me gently with his arm a few times, suddenly put his hand on my knee, pressed it gently. He then put his hand on the boy's head, took him by the hand, and put him in his lap, petting him continually. And so that's an example of a tic people with Tourette's can have, where they kind of just touch other people, and it's not really, obviously it's not intentional, but that is definitely something that people with Tourette's do. From Caroline Pitchler, for he hums the melody from Figaro as I played and beat the time on my shoulders. He suddenly moved a chair up, sat down, told me to carry on playing the bass, and began to improvise such wonderfully beautiful variations that everyone listened to the tones of the German Orpheus with bated breath. But then he suddenly tired of it, jumped up, and in a bad mood which so often came over him, he began to leap over tables and chairs, meow like a cat, and turn somersaults like an unruly boy. And, that's a really common tic for people to have, is meow or bark or something like that, but especially the repetition of it. Another one, a perceptive commentary on Mozart's apparently involuntary vulgar vocalizations was provided by Joseph Lang, a famous actor and talented amateur artist who painted portraits of Mozart in 1782 and 1789. He said that never was Mozart less recognizably a great man in his conversation and actions than when he was busied with important work. At times he not only spoke confusedly and disconnectedly, but occasionally made jests of a nature which one did not expect of him. Indeed, he even deliberately forgot himself in this behavior. Either he intentionally concealed his inner tension behind superficial frivolity, or he took delight into throwing into sharp contrast the divine ideas of his music in these sudden outbursts of vulgar platitudes. And there's actually one instance where Mozart even wrote about his coprographia, his coprolalia. He wrote 2 letters to his father. Although Mozart's scatology was abundantly evident in written form in his letters, coprographia, did he actually speak that way? Mozart himself answered this for us in the affirmative in 2 1777 letters to his father, with later confirmation by his brother-in-law, Joseph Lang. At the end of a serious letter, October 1777, Mozart spoke of singing a canon with a certain Father Emilian, in which I took the third voice, intonating staccato voce. I'm sorry, I have no idea. Or voice, I really don't know. In a different text, Peter Emilian, oh, you idiot, you lick my arse, I beg you. Just 1 month later, Mozart confessed to his father that on several occasions he entertained his host, the director of the world-famed Mannheim Orchestra, along with his family and important orchestra members, by reciting after dinner scatological rhymes by the hour. I did frequently, without any difficulty, but quite easily, perpetrate rhymes, the same being, moreover, sheer garbage, that is, on subjects as muck, shitting, and arse-licking. I mean, maybe he was just strange and, eccentric, and that's why he did these things. Is this not, so clearly Tourette's? I mean, I think it is overwhelming, the evidence of this. And so not only that, these are specific, tics, but in general, he was extremely hyperactive. So here's an example of him being hyperactive from Sophie Habel, who nursed Mozart's wife. Even when he was washing his hands in the morning, he walked up and down in the room, never standing still, tapped one heel against the other, was always deep in thought. At the table, he would often twist up a corner of a napkin and rub his upper lip with it, without appearing to know what he was doing, and he often made extraordinary grimaces with his mouth. Also, his hands and feet were always in motion. He was always playing with something. And so there are actually, multiple references to him having, in that was an example for hyperactivity, but also of the grimacing, that's a facial tic. And there are multiple instances where it's described that he had a lot of facial tics where his face out of nowhere would change very suddenly. I'm using a different camera now, so I hope this doesn't look totally different. So sorry if that's really inconsistent. So why is Mozart not, widely represented as having Tourette's? Why is it that if you look on his Wikipedia page, there's nothing that says that he has Tourette's at all? There's a reference to his scatological writing, and that's it. And most other places, if you look at biographical accounts of his life, you're never going to see a reference that he had Tourette's, even though I think it's pretty clear that he did. He had not only many simple tics, but he had many complex tics. He was a very hyperactive person. And not only that, but he was shown in Amadeus, he was portrayed as being really irresponsible financially and always, being very broke. I think a lot of that could be attributed to poor impulse control, which is a trait of Tourette's as well. And so there's always this question of why did he die so young? Why did his life, kind of end the way that it did? I think if you look at his life through the lens of him being very disabled, I think that explains a lot. So the other thing is that he also had a lot of illnesses throughout his life that were pretty severe. And some of these are not totally agreed upon, but he likely had at different times in his life scarlet fever, recurring tonsillitis, smallpox, and typhus. It's possible that he had viral hepatitis, his cause of death. that's not totally known. But his cause of death is mostly attributed to late stage kidney disease. And not only that, but I mean, he was described as being very thin. I think, in general with developmental disorders, low muscle mass is pretty common. And having a weaker immune system in general is also pretty common in people with developmental disabilities. Like, I don't think it is that much of a mystery. I think he was very disabled in a lot of different ways. I think his life was very, very difficult in many different ways. I think he was probably, even though he was very famous in the time that he was alive, he, I think, had a lot of really significant issues as well, and probably experienced some pretty severe stigma from the people that were around him. So, like I mentioned at the beginning, with developmental disabilities in general, but especially with Tourette's, like the disability factor is very highly influenced by the social constructs that surround the disability. So, but especially with Tourette's, when you are in a situation where the people around you are, are judging you really hard for your tics, and they're saying things to you like, why don't you just stop doing that, or like, you're bringing shame on the family with like whatever, like your disability, or that those kinds of social stressors can really contribute to, like I said, higher stress can lead to more severe symptoms of Tourette's. I mean, first of all, Tourette's was not discovered until like a while after he died. And even then, it really hasn't been until much more recently that Tourette's has been definitively diagnosed as a neurological disorder and not as a psychological disorder. And, it hasn't been until much more recently that, like I said, that there are specific neurotransmitter issues that contribute to that cause Tourette's. And so, who knows how people reacted to his tics at the time, and in addition to his hyperactivity and other traits like that. There's also a lot of evidence that he probably had bipolar. He went through periods of very severe depression and what appear to also be, periods of mania. At the end of one of the papers that I read in preparation for this video, they say like, Tourette's can be very disabling for some people. So it's amazing how he was able to like cope with it and not be disabled by it. But like, I think he definitely was affected by it. And the fact that so many people, people really loved him or they really hated him, that was probably because like he was not a socially acceptable figure. His behaviors were not socially acceptable. Like in the Curb Your Enthusiasm, like Tourette's chef episode, where like the guy with Tourette's is just like yelling out swear words all the time, and it doesn't matter to him that he's saying these things. Like, when people have coprolalia tics, they feel really bad about it. Like, it's not this like easy thing where you can just like you just move on and it's not a big deal. Like, people with Tourette's are very deeply affected by how other people react to their tics, and they feel a lot of very strong emotions about it. And not only that, but he was probably self-medicating with alcohol. He almost certainly had a substance abuse issue, and specifically with alcohol. And even though that did not directly cause his death, I don't think it can be said that it didn't contribute to his ill health. I mean, I think there's so many things that are like downstream effects of his Tourette's that did contribute to like his having ill health, whether that is copious amounts of stress from many different aspects of his life, to alcoholism, to in general probably just not having a very strong immune system to begin with because of his developmental disability. I think a lot of the mystery behind why he had the life that he did and why it ended the way he did. I don't think it is as mysterious as people make it out to be when you include that this was clearly a really huge part of his life and clearly a really huge challenge. So I think this could probably be applied to a lot of different, disabilities or other things that are like stigmatized. But I really think that there's kind of like what, since I'm a linguist, I have to, use like linguistic terms, but like there's like almost like a recursive stigmatization cycle that is made up of the consequences of the absence of representation of Tourette's. A lack of representation leads to ignorance about the condition, and that ignorance leads to stigma around it. And then that stigma leads to stereotyping, and this kind of spectacleization of Tourette's, turning Tourette's just into a spectacle or into a punchline or a joke. And so all of that kind of stigma contributes to social stress, so that, the expectation of tic repression that ultimately exasperates symptoms. Social stress leads to increased tic severity, leads to when the more ticks you have, the more social stigma you will incur, which leads to more stress, which leads to more severe tics, which leads to more stigma. So there's within the cycle, there is a cycle in itself. And so this increase in symptoms, but just the stress overall, contributes to a generally lower quality of life. And that can lead to substance abuse, self medication. And that also contributes to poor health outcomes. And so all of these, what's the opposite of privilege? all of these, all of these different things contribute to, as a population of people with Tourette's, on like a group level, people with Tourette's cannot really self-actualize. We can't embrace having Tourette's because of all of these social factors that, we can't embrace who we are as people. We can't embrace our conditions, but in general, we can't embrace our whole selves. So even though, Mozart and his work, his music is very much appreciated and very much embraced, him as a whole person is not. Even though he was this absolutely genius, savant musician that completely changed music, his life ended when he was 35 years old. He was really sick throughout his whole life. He had he struggled with depression. He struggled with so many different aspects of his life. So it's like, yeah, he was successful in a way, but he also died at 35 and might have been an alcoholic. I think his life was probably really, really hard. This just comes back to the lack of representation, right? Is that as a group of people with Tourette's, we can't fully self-actualize ourselves. We can't fully be represented in society, even if there are certain aspects of our lives that are embraced. Us as whole people, we are not embraced. And so the people that actually do have Tourette's that are successful somewhat, that part of their life is hidden and it's denied. I really think that there's a really huge denialism around Mozart's Tourette syndrome. And if you Google it, did Mozart have Tourette's? Basically, what will come up is like he might have had it, but he might not have had it. We can't definitively really know. We don't really know, but we do know. The only reason that we can't definitively 100% say with total certainty that he absolutely had Tourette's is because he died 200 years ago, and we can't diagnose him from the grave. But he clearly had Tourette's. So the fact that it is still denied that he had it, I think is a really huge disservice to everyone with Tourette's. And I mean, just in general, it goes to show how difficult it is for people with Tourette's to break out of this cycle of stigmatization. And like, I don't think it's our fault. I don't think it's because we're not trying hard enough. I think it's because of this like larger cycle of stigma and ignorance and like demonization of Tourette's, that we're just, you know, we're not seen as being whole people. We're not seen as like being anything more than a spectacle and a joke, you know, and something to be laughed at. And Tourette's is certainly not seen as something that could contribute to a person being a genius. It's not seen as something that is, you know, a trait of a highly intelligent person. It's not seen as a creative condition. It's seen as like a a freakish condition, that, you know, that why would you ever need any kind of empathy for people with Tourette's? You know, it's just weird. Why would anyone care? Like I said earlier, like I think Tourette's is like kind of inherently kind of a musical condition where, like, I mean, for Mozart especially, like clearly like he he had this ability to, like, if he could just like hear a melody and then immediately like, or like hear like a whole song and then immediately be able to play it like right afterwards. Like he had this like level of not just talent but like memory that was really really strong. And so it's like, you know, yeah, like we Touretters have attention deficit, but we also have like hyper focus and like I think probably um heightened memory, you know, among other things. And in general, music has a suppressive effect on symptoms of Tourette's. So, you know, I'm a very musical person. I have, you know, I used to play the piano. I used to play, you know, pieces by Mozart, and now I really like singing. And like I listen to music all the time, and it absolutely helps me cope with my symptoms. And like, but it's not just like there's like a like it literally, like I'll put like the quote on the screen, but there's like an actual, like there's a direct effect that music has on symptoms of Tourette's that really suppress tics. And in general, like when it comes to like we are people that stim, you know, stimming is really associated with autism, but like people with Tourette's absolutely stim. Like that's probably the main thing that helps me cope with my tics, is to like just if I have a repetitive behavior in my hand, like for example, if I'm having a tick in my hand, I mean, where I like go like this and I stretch on my hand like really hard and it kind of like hurts. I don't really have this very often now, but I used to have this really badly. And so I started doing is that like it would be like I would just like have my hand and like I like couldn't move it. And so instead I go like this, and it's like so I'll still kind of go like that, but like it helps kind of work through that pain. It helps kind of distract from, you know, what I was like, what the tick was. And so it's like in general, over time, I've really learned to embrace my hyperactivity, because when I suppress my hyperactivity, that makes my tics worse. And so it's like if I try to embrace all of the aspects of having Tourette's and all of the ways that it affects me, that helps me like function better in general. And trying to just deny myself from any kind of repetitive movement entirely, it does not help. It does not help to just try to bottle all of it up inside. I have to express it somehow. And the best way I can do that is through music. So I think in general, people with Tourette's are pretty musical people. And, you know, not to mention the fact that the greatest musician of all time had like severe Tourette's. Like he did not have minor Tourette's. I mean, him like jumping up and down and like running around meowing, having these like really obscene like coprolalia tics in public around other people. Like he clearly had it much more than just minor Tourette's. Like I don't think there's any question that he had it. What's really the key to breaking out of this cycle of, you know, a lack of representation leads to ignorance and stigma, and then all of this leads to a poorer quality of life, and all of that leads to, you know, people with Tourette's struggling to function in society and struggling to find success in a lot of different ways. And us being held down, you know, leads to a lack of representation. And it's the cycle just keeps going on and on and on. And so, like, the way that we break the cycle is by actually, like, accurately representing, like, real people and real history. Like, I don't understand why there's still any question that he had Tourette's. I don't understand why it's not more well known that Mozart had Tourette's. I think it's a really huge shame, and if anything, like, I think it's a really big problem. I mean, one of the biggest musicians in the world right now has Tourette's, and she's open about it, but like, it's not something that, you know, I'm not blaming Billie Eilish for like not being a bigger, you know, like not doing more for people with Tourette's, but it's like, what can she do when her condition is so stigmatized? Like, because I think she does want to show people that like that is like, I'm sorry, I really haven't seen a lot of her stuff, but like I know in like a documentary about her, she did show like herself having like a tic attack, and like that's like really brave. Like that's a really, really brave thing to do. But like online, if you watch any videos of her like having tics, like it's like so bad. Like not her, but like the people, like people's reaction to her is so bad, saying that she's like glitching or like other like stupid, like it's so stigmatized, even though she's this like amazingly talented, beautiful woman who's so successful. She still can't, Billie Eilish really still can't be like the face of Tourette's or like a good representation of Tourette's, because you can't simultaneously be a successful person and also be viewed as having Tourette's, because in people's minds, like the mainstream conception of what Tourette's is that it is a spectacle. So anything more than just Tourette's is a joke, anything that actually humanizes Tourette's is not something that can actually like appear in like, you know, in like the public forum. Like it can't just be like what I'm trying to say is that like it can't just be like people with Tourette's can't just like, we can't just like pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and like be our own representation. And like we can do that. Like there are so many people with Tourette's that like have like make art about, you know, make documentaries and try to represent themselves, but it's like I think there has to be a broader social movement in order to break this cycle. It's not even like, oh, we need to lift up people, you know, lift up like voices with Tourette's. Like obviously I think we should do that, but like I'm just talking about like accurate history. Like if there's just like an accurate history of like real people's real lives, like that is representation of like real history, you know, that could be the representation that we really need. So yeah, um we're reaching the end of the video. You know, in the future I want to make a video about my own experience of having Tourette's, and you know how I got diagnosed, and you know all of that. But I think that's it for today. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.